So Zach De La Roca, who's the lead singer of Rage Against the Machine, has a Twitter presence. And about a year ago, he was kind of famously chastised by a follower who said, "You know, man, I really liked your music, but then you got all political." Which is really funny, because if you ever listen to Rage Against the Machine, it's all political, Mask. It's all political, right? And so, that's one of those kind of, maybe you should listen to what you're listening to. I don't know. All right, we're going to talk about voting rights today. I think that the PowerPoint is still rending, so it's not quite up there yet, but the questions are. And so it'll be up by the end of class, though, so you can see it. Let's talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, okay? We've talked a little bit about that when we're talking about civil rights, but it's really key, okay? Decades of protests. You guys, decades of protests, right? Not weeks, months, years, decades of protests. Lead to the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and it's signed into being by President Johnson. President Johnson, as a legislator, as a senator, was always very egalitarian whenever it came to race, which is not to say that in terms of his own personal statements that he was particularly non-racist, okay? That said, he believed that everyone was equal. He just was, people are complicated, okay? People are complicated. So, President Johnson was very much in favor of this. He pushed it. He used the Johnson treatment to get it through, as a matter of fact. That's one of those things that he honed very well. He was a giant man, and he would loom over people and bend them literally to his will. And this is one of those things that he worked very hard for. This is 100 years after, 100 years after the Constitution grants Black men the right to vote. Okay? The Voting Rights Act goes in place to enforce, right? Because remember, this is really important, that 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and most amendments after the 12th Amendment, okay, specifically give Congress power to enforce. Okay? That's a specific power that's in the Constitution for them to enforce it. And so it takes 100 years. It bans a number of illegal practices in federal elections, not state, not local, that comes later, but in federal elections. Poll taxes, literacy tests, remember we saw that literacy test from Louisiana? And voter intimidation, right? Which is interesting. Do you guys remember the civil liberties exercise that you did, right? Regarding Latinos being told not to vote? Where's the line between intimidation, right, and free speech? Okay, so think about that sort of stuff. So where are we now? Well, the Vra Pre-Clearance is something that we had. If you were a state that had a history of discrimination. A history of discrimination in voting practices. And these are the states where the entire state, if it's dark green, and then part of the state in light green, okay, these states had a history of voter discrimination. And so in order to change any voting law, to a more restrictive practice, they had to get clearance from the federal government, from the Justice Department, in order to do that. Okay? This is following 1965. This was recertified adopted by Congress in 2005, as it had been in 1995 and 1985 and 1975, all right? But in 2008, there's a case, Shelby versus Holder. This is John Roberts. He is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's a conservative appointment by George W. Bush. He's very young. He will be Chief Justice for a very long time. And he's currently, even though he was conservative, he is now, Anthony Kennedy had been the swing vote, but his retirement under Trump led to Roberts being the swing vote. He wrote the majority decision in Shelby versus Holder, and it's going to repeal Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which takes away the federal government's power for pre-clearance by the Justice Department, okay? Now, specifically, he says this. He says the issue is it's based on old formulas, right? And so it gives Congress a way to fix it. He says, these are old formulas. Show me some new stuff, not from 1965, okay? And that's a legitimate law. But understand, when we talk about later on, when we talk about activism of the courts, this is clearly an activist action, okay? This is clearly activist. It is overturning an act of Congress, okay? He says Congress did not use that record to fashion a coverage formula grounded in current conditions. It used something that was 40 years old, actually from 75, not from 65. The notorious RBG, may she rest in peace. She passed away 1 year ago, and she wrote the dissent in this case, in which she said, this is clearly undermining the federal government's power, which it is given in the 15th Amendment, to enforce and ensure equality of voting across races. She writes a little more eloquently than I speak, honestly. You should read some of her dissents. They're quite scathing. So these are two alternative views, okay, in regards to the Voting Rights Act. Roberts, who holds the prevailing view that the Voting Rights Act cannot be enforced based upon its older formulas, and RBG saying there is clearly continuous existing discrimination. This law was meant to recertify this law and allow the Justice Department to act under the 15th Amendment. She also says, in regard to voter ID laws, that the greatest threat to public confidence in elections in this case is the prospect of enforcing a purposefully discriminatory law, right? She says this law was purposely enacted in order to discriminate. It imposes an unconstitutional poll tax and risks denying the right to vote to hundreds of thousands of eligible voters. We're not talking about the 43 people that fall through the cracks. Hundreds of thousands who do not have the money to get a government-issued ID which would be accepted. You have a government-issued ID, right? From the University of Oklahoma. You cannot use it to vote. It has to be one that is issued specifically and specifically named by the state with your current address. It's not me, it's you. Since 2008, the enactment, since Shelby versus Holder, of suppressive voter legislation is at its highest since the Civil Rights era, whether it be voter ID, reducing early voting periods, reducing registration periods, voter roll purges. This is where they go through and say, hey, here's some names of felons okay? Let's get rid of everyone. Or this person hasn't voted for the last 2 elections. Let's get rid of their name, even though they're registered to vote. And they get rid of every name, and I'll show you in just a second, that comes close. Okay? And I'll tell you what I mean in just a second. And then the closure of voting locations. Remember that thing about inconvenient polling locations? They closed down numbers, hundreds of voting locations, making it more difficult to vote, creating longer lines, making it less likely that someone would have time to vote. You're given 2 hours off by federal law. If you have to stand in line for 10, then maybe you can't afford to do that. Since 2020, which incidentally, and I do want to point this out, 2020, we have had our highest voting eligible percentage, nearly 67%, nearly 2/3, since 1900. That's a big deal. And the reason why is because of the pandemic, states did what? What'd they do? Vote by mail. Expanded absentee voting periods. Made it easier for people to come register. And we had the highest voting we've had. So when you say, hey, it's not connected, turnout's not connected, people just don't want to go, that's clearly not true. Right? So since 2020, we have expanded access in Washington, Oregon, Hawaii, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Louisiana, Illinois, Indiana, Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, New York, Vermont, and Maine. And Louisiana, I already said, right? Oklahoma actually expanded in some ways, restricted in other ways, but expanded the length of time for in-person voting. Okay? So these that are gray are mixed. Some things restrict, some things don't. The ones that are in burnt orange, boo Texas, right? The ones that are in burnt orange are the ones that overall, the laws that they have enacted restrict voting rights. And that's in the last, look you guys, I'm not talking about history here. This is in the last year. This was this summer. Okay? Montana, Wyoming, Iowa, Kansas, Arkansas, Arizona, Texas, Georgia, and Florida. Is there any significance to any of those states? You want to tell me? You want to tell me?
Specifically Georgia, where they have blue senators but a red legislature.
Georgia, specifically where they have blue senators but a red legislature. Okay. What? Arizona, same thing. Right? Florida, which 2 years ago, I mean, up until 2 years ago, if you had ever committed a felony, ever in your life, right? And that includes, you know, a felony for when you're 19 years old carrying too much marijuana, okay? You can never vote again. 2 years ago in Florida, voters, by one of those referendums that we've talked about, actually it was a voter initiative, okay, overturned that and said you can't do that. Once you've served your time, you should be able to vote. Florida legislators immediately enacted a law that said if you have a fine anywhere and you're a felon, then you still can't vote. But we're not going to tell you if you have a fine. You have to go to any county in Florida to find that out. And if you register to vote while you still have this fine, felony. Okay? Florida had the highest number of ineligible voting age population due to the high number of low-level drug felonies. Oklahoma, very recently, changed their laws as far as felonies are concerned. Though Oklahoma, once you've served your time, you can vote as a felon, okay? But that includes probation and all that, okay? But once you've served your time, you can vote. But Oklahoma, about the same time, actually in 2016, yes, the state of Oklahoma, the people, through an initiative, said these things shouldn't be felonies. They should be misdemeanors. But listen, they are still a felony on your record if you got it before, unless you pay a lawyer to get it expunged. Someone I went to high school with recently contacted me and said, hey, can you expunge these felonies for me? He had 7 in Oklahoma County. They were all low-level drug offenses. I said 7. There we go, 7. In Oklahoma County that were low-level drug offenses. Luckily, I was his, friend or a sucker, one of the two, because he didn't pay much for it. But frankly, if I was an attorney who was working in this business, I would charge $1,000 per count. Right? It's worth my time. Cross-check is that system I was telling you about with voter purging of rolls, purging of voter rolls. Okay? Here's the problem. It's highly inaccurate. All the states in red have used it. It overrepresents minorities in its exclusion because it does a lot of weird things. First of all, it does not use social security numbers as a way to see if it's the same person. If it's a junior or a senior or a third, they just ignore it. And it ignores mismatched middle names. So, if your name is Juan Cruz in Florida, how many are there of you? A 1,000, 2,200, 4,700, right? And we see the same thing, right? Dante Brown. It over-excludes among the minority population. It's not a good system. It doesn't work very well. All these states have used it to purge their rolls. And they purge the rolls for 2 reasons. One, there's a felony, right? Or a person by that name hasn't voted in the last 2 elections. Or 3, whatever standard they set, which is arbitrary. You only have to register to vote once. I've registered to vote 1 time. I was 18, right? It was a long time ago, you guys. This is Kris Kobach. He's the Secretary of State in Kansas. He ran for Kansas governor in 2018 and failed. He was selected by President Trump to head the now defunct Voter Fraud Commission. The Voter Fraud Commission, when he was head of the Kansas state elections, he lost multiple voter suppression federal court cases, illegal voting roll purges, voter ID cases, proof of citizenship that he was requiring. Right? Those of you born in the United States, how many of you carry around your birth certificate? I don't. I'm not even entirely sure where it is. It should be in a file in that room, right? It's unclear, okay? He was held in contempt of court for 2018 for refusing to follow the orders of the federal court, and he's appointed by President Trump to head this voter fraud commission. And he does, and finds nothing. The only instances of fraud that have been found were by a mail carrier who threw out Democratic votes and voted for his dead mother in Pennsylvania. I think there's another similar one in Virginia or West Virginia. Okay? We're talking 2 people, right? Out of 300 million, did their votes matter? Not particularly, right? Fraud doesn't exist. Voter fraud doesn't exist. No matter what conspiracy theory talk radio show you listen to, I need to say to you, voter fraud does not statistically exist. Have there been isolated incidents? Yes. Have there been any widespread voter fraud? No. Have there been any levels of voter fraud that would affect an election? No. President Trump says, in addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally. Right? President Trump was spreading this misinformation. This is completely inaccurate. Millions of people did not vote illegally. That did not happen. I'm not telling you from a political viewpoint. I'm telling you a fact. Here's the cost of voter ID. You have to pay for the identification. How much does it cost to get a driver's license?
No.
I heard 40 and I heard 25. What? 25?
Real ID is more expensive.
I think it depends on where you are.
My driver's license was 25.
But driver's license for 25. How much for real ID?
It's like 35, isn't it?
35?
Me and my wife are
80 altogether, so 40. Okay? And which we all have to have a real ID by next year. Okay? So that's $40. Is $40 nothing to you? How many of you can give me $40 right now? If so, I have plans for the weekend. You can just leave it right here. Right? It'll be anonymous. How many of you have no problem giving me $40? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay? 14 of you. 14 of you have no problem giving me $40. Out of at least 140, I mean, hopefully more than that today, we'll see, right? But still, 10%, where it doesn't hurt. And again, I'm talking to a class of elites. You guys are in college at the flagship university in the state of Oklahoma. Time associated with obtaining ID. How many of you have gone through the real ID process, by the way? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. What sort of time did you have? Because you're married.
we moved here from Florida. It took us 3 tries. It took us about 8 hours a day to
3 tries, went down to get it 3 times, and the day that they did get it, it took 8 hours. How many of you are going to go down 3 times and then spend 8 hours in a day and do that easily? How many of you have 8 hours to give me tomorrow? And you guys have time. Okay? You don't have a job that you have to be to that doesn't give you days off. Documentation for obtaining required ID. It's also a big deal. Like I said, I kind of know where my birth certificate is, right? And my marriage license, right? I just had to re-up my passport, so I found my marriage license recently. Okay? But it's difficult, and if you've lost one of those, you have to go pay for it. And that's $35 to replace a birth certificate in the state of Oklahoma. Transportation. Technically, if you don't have a driver's license, you can't drive. And, let me show you this. Let's look at Alabama. Alabama residents currently rank as the most disadvantaged voters in the country in terms of access to voting identification issuing office, or identification issuing offices. 1,032% of the state of Alabama live more than 10 miles from their nearest issue granting office, ID granting office. Think about that. You can't walk. It has the 6th highest percent of voting age population without access to vehicles as well. 6% of the people don't even have access to vehicles. 26% of those potential voters without access to vehicles live more than 10 miles of a state identification issuing office. Second only to Mississippi's 33.6. And then they passed a strict voter ID law, went into effect, and then they closed 31 of the offices that they had. You want to see where? In all of these states, right? And I want you to know, I like this one, D, okay? D shows percentage of Obama support in 2012, okay? See the dark purple? Much more likely to support non-white registered voters. The darker, higher percentage of non-white. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Through a belt. Don't tell me it wasn't aimed somewhere. That's not coincidence that it goes through the black belt of Alabama. So here's the next question. How long would you wait in line to vote? Okay, you guys are college students. OU has started giving the Tuesday off, okay? So you actually have the whole day off and you can go vote. How long is the maximum amount of time you will stand in line to vote? 2 hours?
Well, I don't vote.
Okay, I have 2 hours. How many of you are going to say 2 hours or less? Raise your hand. That's a lot. How many of you are going to say 5 hours or less? Raise your hand. Or 2 to 5 hours. Okay. How many are going to say 6 hours or more? You would stand in line. Those are some low numbers. That's what? 6? This is 4,000 people waiting in line in Cincinnati. Because they closed so many voting precincts, there was nowhere to vote except for there. 4,000 people standing in line to vote. I get irritated if there's 12 people in front of me, honestly. I mean, have you seen me in a Sprouts line? God, open another thing. So Brian Kemp, he's Secretary of State in Georgia. You guys might recognize him. He's now governor. Okay. He ran for governor in 2018, but he was in charge of the elections while he was running for governor. He lost multiple voter suppression federal court cases, illegal voting roll purges, voter ID purges. He won that governor race to Stacey Abrams, against Stacey Abrams. She would have been the first black governor of Georgia if she'd won. First black woman to govern a state in American history. They closed 214 precincts under Kemp. Understaffed and under-equipped voting locations. He oversaw the purge of nearly 500,000 voters, most of whom were minorities. The last day to register was 10/5/18. First day to vote 10/9. Hundreds of voting machines sat unused in Georgia as voters waited in long lines. Voting precincts closed across. He won by that many votes. He won by that many votes. Don't tell me that the institutions that are established to determine who can vote when don't have an impact on that. He won by 50,000. Oh, by the way, if you get purged from a voter roll, you don't know until you go vote. Okay? You don't know until you go vote and they say you're not here. Okay? Since Shelby versus Holder, Texas has closed 403 voting places. Arizona 212, Louisiana 103, Mississippi 44, Alabama 66, South Carolina and North Carolina 12 and 27. Milwaukee had 5 polling places for 600,000 voters in 2020. 5 for 600,000 voters. So, what are things we can do? We can do automatic voter registration. You turn 18, the government certainly knows it, right? I mean, automatically register to vote. Your driver's license, remember that? It says it. Okay, you turn 18, you get a voter ID card in the mail. That would work. Voter pre-registration. So you can register as you're voting, right? You go in, you register to vote, and then you can vote. Extend registration periods, revive early voting periods, end felony disenfranchisement. Remember we talked about that with the new Jim Crow, right? It's one of the things that Michelle Alexander points out. And then, like I said, OU, but listen, OU gives you a holiday. You get the day off, and the majority of you would wait less than 5 hours. Think about that. And seriously, you're young. You have legs, right? So what do you think would most improve? I have a poll here. Actually, Eric, will you take attendance while I'm getting that poll ready?
Attendance is live.
I want to be clear that turnout is good for both parties. Okay? President Trump had 11 million more voters for him in 2020 than he did in 2016. This is not a partisan thing that I'm talking about. This is not a political viewpoint. I'm talking about democracy here. What do the people say? And if you believe in democracy, you believe in a, fair election. There we go. All right. How are we on attendance? We got a little time left?
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to use this time to make some announcements. Okay? Number 1, in your labs, be respectful to one another and also to your fellows. I've heard reports from my fellows of people just being rude to them, right? I mean, they're instructors, so don't be rude, okay? Number 2, you still have to wear your mask. I got actually an email yesterday from someone in this class who was here on Monday who has now tested positive for COVID. So that puts us out for another 2 weeks. My other class, so far, until OU Texas happens, right? We actually move off. But this one we have 1. So I'm down from 3 2 weeks ago, or last week, to 1. Right, which is good. Good, it's good, right? Keep wearing your masks, get vaccinated, all that stuff. How are we on attendance?
We're done.
Done? Okay. I'm going to put this poll up. Oh, I'm almost there. Okay, I've activated the poll. All right. So, also you have no labs on Friday. Because you're expected to go down to Dallas and spend all of your money, which is silly, right? Okay. It is OU Texas weekend. We take off the Friday before, and we then beat Texas soundly on Saturday. That's the plan. And on Friday evening, we have games on Friday night too. That's the plan, okay? All right, so answer your poll. Take care of yourself. Do not get arrested this weekend.